Welcome to the Prof Talk Pod, brought to you by the Engaged Professor. Every 2 weeks, join us as we talk about tips and tricks to help you connect with your students, engage with industry, and stay up to date on all the teaching trends. We'll give you actionable strategies that will help improve your teaching today. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. Welcome to the Prof Talk Pod. My name is Becky Aiken, and as you can see this week, I am coming to you with a solo show just by myself, and we're going to talk a little bit about the concept of scaffolding. Now, scaffolding is built around the idea of the zone of proximal development, which Lev Vygotsky, I'll get that right one of these times, developed many years ago. And basically, the zone of proximal development suggests that our students have this kind of centerpiece of things that they are already able to do or already understand or know. And then there's these things that are out of reach for them to learn. And in between there is something that we can actually impact from a teaching standpoint. There's this area of opportunity to help support students to get to that next step, to learn something, to push a little bit beyond their current skills and ability level to develop eventually into someone that can do these things on their own. Now, the actual idea or the terminology of scaffolding itself is not easy to find where it was developed from. It just seems to show up in literature around similar time as the zone of proximal development. But the analogy holds like if you were ever painted a house or wanted to roof a house before, you probably would have needed some sort of temporary structure to help you reach higher called scaffold. So the same concept is similar to help students reach just a little bit higher. They need some sort of structure to help support that. And in the cases of learning, we want it to be temporary so that eventually they can do those things, they can think that way, they have that knowledge to move to that next step without the support. But instead of just walking in on the first day and expecting your students to say, write an entire paper about the history of the influencer marketing industry, you might start by building smaller touch points throughout the course to help them do that. So that might look like starting with some sort of baseline research, broadly speaking, research project, right? Where you ask them to find 5 sources that talk about the influencer industry and write a summary of what each source means and how it could be useful. So you're helping them think about these sources of information and start to write a little bit. Maybe it looks like creating an outline or first drafts or second drafts where they get feedback. Those kind of supports can help students move from not knowing something and being a little bit intimidated about how to do the thing to gaining the knowledge and then figuring out how to put it together with some support. Now, it's possible that as students advance within your degree program, if we look at this from a bigger perspective, maybe you give more support when they're freshmen and you kind of slowly back off on the support levels as they work through your curriculum to help support them learning how to do these things on their own. Now, ideally, right, you move into that comfort level being able to do things, and then you can push a little higher. The zone of proximal development will move as the student's knowledge, skills, and abilities advance. Think about this in terms of like even doing the podcast, right? So if I ask students to do a podcast about their experience at the University of Kansas, and I want them to turn that in for the assignment, well, one of the skills they might need is learning how to talk about their experience. So maybe we host in class discussions to kind of build them toward that external output or that final output that I'm asking them to do. Maybe we watch, analyze, and evaluate podcasts to help support their learning and understanding. Now, we know research has looked into scaffolding, and there's lots of benefits of doing this for students. The research suggests it can help students reach learning goals they might not have already otherwise reached because they're not just going to shut down. So imagine the last time you were asked to do something you've never done before. Maybe that was conduct research on a new area. Maybe it was do the roof on your house. Maybe it was build something for one of your kiddos' school projects and you maybe haven't done it before. It was pretty scary. And oftentimes, our motivations to do things that we don't really know or understand can be pretty low because it's scary, because we don't know what good looks like, and because we often don't know where to start. So, having some structural support for students can help motivate them to actually engage. And you can see this if you hand out a case study and it's, maybe 2 pages long, it's got 3 questions, and that's all you give students. And you say, here, go for this. Now, if they're a first time freshman and maybe have never done a formal case study before or haven't done it very often, their motivation to do it is probably going to suffer because they're not sure where to start. But if you include, say, some hints for getting started, some hints for doing this well, or maybe you even walk through the first question in class and talk about the structure of how you can attack it or how you can think through it, that's going to help students be more motivated to do it because they're not going to feel like they're on an island with no help. It can also create just a more generally positive learning environment, having support structures that help students think through tasks and build toward the ultimate outcome. Going back to having an end of the semester paper that is due at the very end and we assign it at the beginning and you just say go for it doesn't build confidence over time and can result in a negative learning environment because students don't know how they're doing. They don't know what they need to do better or how they can improve, and they're getting very little feedback or support to be successful. It also can encourage incorporation of feedback. So research suggests that if we have this kind of scaffolded process for learning, then students, one, will feel more likely and freer to incorporate and change as things evolve, as opposed to seeing their output as like, this is the end all be all. After this one, I'm done. Now, it can be challenging sometimes to approach all of your assignments in from a scaffolding perspective. It's difficult to know right out the gate where all of your learners are at. And so if you're not doing anything to gauge their knowledge or abilities early on, whether that's a pretest or an early assignment, or if it's a small enough class where you can really get to know your students to understand where they're at, you might not know where they need support and you might either assume they need it and give them too much and they're not challenged, or you might assume they're okay and then you start scaffolding, but you do it too late in the process. They needed help earlier than what you gave. And that being said, different students are going to potentially need different levels of scaffolding. And that can be difficult to determine in a large class, especially. If you've got 300 students, you're likely teaching across a pretty wide range of skills and abilities. So knowing how much is enough and how much is too much can be difficult. Now, there are some ways around that. So, for example, you might provide suggestions of ways to scaffold an assignment and then, tell students if A is easy for you, then to go a little bit further, you should do B and C. Sometimes when I do skills training assignments, and especially in analytics courses, when I teach analytics, and we're talking about using Excel for data analysis, or we're talking about using Tableau to create visualizations, I will find trainings, usually on YouTube that or LinkedIn Learning, that give students the opportunity to engage with Excel or Tableau or Google Sheets or whichever platform we're working in. But I will often say, this is a beginning training. If you can already do and list a few things that are the primary goals of that training, then here's an additional training that can move you forward. And those type of trainings help students build skills for their final projects. So in an analytics class, when I ask them to find a data set and analyze that data set, the scaffolding is me having them do these trainings, do smaller check-in assignments with spreadsheets that I give them, and then they're building the skill that they need to do that final project. And I can help identify where they're at today to help move them a little bit forward. One of the things that I think is important as you think about scaffolding is reevaluating your perspective on what learning means and what learning is good or what progress looks like. I know many of you have heard me say this before, but I believe in a backward design approach. So, understanding what you want students to know and be able to do when they leave your class. That doesn't always mean that every single student in your class will be able to do those things and know those things when they leave, because every student's baseline is a little bit different and every student's effort level is going to vary a little bit. When we think about the zone of proximal development, we have to kind of orient our brain around, okay, here is the goal. This is the goal that we are trying to meet. But here are some things, some evidence that we have moved toward it that might help us determine if students are learning. Because if we really think about it, right? If your if your expectation is grading at A, B, C, D, typically meeting expectations, right, is a C or B level. Does that mean your students have mastery of your learning outcomes? Probably not, right? Probably they are mostly there. Think it's very rare that every student leaves a class with an A or B, so they've exceeded the mastery level or they are at the mastery level of the learning objectives that you have. So does that mean that anybody who doesn't get those grades should move on to the next class or should get a degree? Well, the answer is clearly no, because as the euphemism goes, C's get degrees. So, what does that mean for those students? Does that mean that we have decided that as long as we push them forward in their knowledge and forward in their skills, that they have learned something and we've moved their zone of proximal development enough that we feel like they're ready for the next step? So you do have to think a little bit about that when you look at scaffolding because you are teaching to students at different levels and you're going to have to determine how much support to give them based on what you want the outcome to be. How much of the thing that you're asking them to do you want them to be able to do at an expert level? Most of the time in undergraduate education, expecting expert level from students who've spent maybe 2 years in your degree program probably isn't realistic. Most of us have been teaching for many, many years and maybe went to school for 10 years before we received expertise status in our very specific academic discipline. So we do have to think a little bit more critically about what success looks like and how we determine whether learners are making progress. I'm a big process based person, so I really like to evaluate the process of how students got to an end result and evaluate the quality of the output in terms of the learning goals. And so I have to think a lot about like, is this enough that the student has demonstrated that they have learned the thing I want them to learn? Maybe they're not an expert, but did they learn, say, how to communicate clearly in a group? If it wasn't 100% perfect, well, they probably still learned how to communicate clearly in the group. They just didn't get rid of every single or ah they've ever said. Now, sometimes this could look like, so that's one thing this could look like is breaking a bigger project into smaller chunks and then building smaller skill-based things that help work them toward that bigger project. Another thing that you might do is actually talk the students through the task the first time that they've done it. A lot of the going back to the analytics example, a lot of those videos, that's exactly what they're doing, right? They're walking students through applying this very specific formula to Excel. You also could do that by having students group together and talk through a task together while they complete it so that their support isn't just you, the faculty member, but they can actually support each other. I think that's one of the useful things about maybe starting the semester with a group case study. If they've never done case studies before and your class is very case study based, having them work on that first one with someone else so they can kind of see how it goes, ask questions, and feel like they have a safe place to maybe learn the how of a case study before they get judged on the output, that can be a really effective way to kind of scaffold their learning and then ask them to do things more autonomously, ask them to do things more individually as they work through that. Can also help to give student examples of the outputs that you're looking for. This is one thing I struggle a lot with giving student examples, especially when I teach in the marketing area, because it is a creative discipline. And in the past, when I've given examples, I find I tend to get carbon copies of that example as the output. So when it comes to scaffolding, that's actually something I don't do very often. I don't give students examples of completed work. I tend to do more opportunities for feedback on the drafts of their work so that they can revise what they're working on. And that way, a lot of different things can be good. In most of the discipline areas that I teach, there's not one way to approach something, there's a lot of ways to approach something. So I will say that that is, one area that it's an option for you, but it's not one that I've taken, but it's definitely an option and can be really useful, especially for freshman level students. And it also can reduce some of the anxiety on the grade side if they know kind of what good looks like. I will say it though that you might be able to refer to practical examples of the thing you're asking them to do. So if I have students create a podcast instead of write a paper about some topic in sport administration, maybe I send them to some podcasts that talk about sport administration, governance, sport news that they can listen to get an idea of what a product and output looks like. I especially like to do that for practical based projects because it gives them a example that isn't tied to a specific grade and that can allow them a little bit more creativity in what their final output is. Another thing that you might do while you scaffold, I mentioned this already, but you can give students like tip sheets or suggestion sheets or hint sheets as they work through different projects and different assignments so that they have something to go off of as they work through again, especially early on in this semester. And if you're thinking really critically about how you're planning your classes and you're backward designing so you know your goals, you come up with assessments that will allow students to demonstrate that they have met those goals, they can do those things, they've learned those things. Then everything else you design in the class should be scaffolding, should be moving you from here's a student, here's what they can do today, here's that zone of proximal development where I can give them support to push their learning forward so that on the final project, they can do it. Now, when you plan for that, it's really important to think about the level that the student is at. Again, I think, a freshman class, an intro class might have a little more support than a senior capstone class. And even a graduate class, you might be pushing them a little bit further forward. So you have to think about that when you're planning this, like what level are the students at? Are you teaching students who are mostly majoring in a specific topic, or is it students with a wide variety of backgrounds? What type of university are you at, and what's the typical makeup of your student? All of those things go into that level of support that you provide. And it's important to tell students that your scaffolding activities because that will help build buy-in for what students often see as the least important assignments, right? The things that students call busy work in my classes might feel like busy work, but they're all designed to be smaller pieces of the whole to give them practice and support as they work toward the whole. But if you don't tell students that, they might not see the bigger picture. So I will often tell students when we're working on some sort of in class group activity during lecture, this is exactly what exam questions are going to look like. This is exactly how I would expect you to complete your final project. In the Icons and Influence course, the student's final output is a presentation where they talk about a specific social media influencer or celebrity icon, and they basically identify the levers of influence in the social media content of those individuals. Well, there's some skills that we need to build to get there, right? So we do case studies on icons where they identify levers within the life of that individual. We do in class presentations around what makes celebrity. All of these pieces are things that play into the bigger whole of that final presentation. And I tell students, this is an example of what I want you to do when you approach that final project. I'm not going to give you the specific questions you need to ask for your final project because we have done a case study that asks you to apply the levers of influence to a person. And I want you to do the same thing only for your chosen individual. So the more that you communicate that, the easier it is to have them put the effort into the in-class things. So because they see the benefit of it, they're at least if they don't see it, they've heard it and they might internalize it. Doesn't work for everyone, but I find being transparent in the why behind my processes does help build student engagement with those things in the moment and might get them thinking a little bit more critically about, okay, this is what was hard for me when we did this. So this is the skill set or the knowledge area I need to go back and build so I can be successful on the final project. It also allows me as a faculty member to see those things in real time and see what we need to revisit to help them be successful on those final projects. So, those are just some of the things you can do to scaffold. It's a term we hear a lot, and sometimes it isn't clear what it means, but there's a lot of different ways to do it depending on the assignment you have, the length of time you have, and the students that are showing up every day to your classes. The number one thing you should do is get to know those students a little bit, give them some sort of pretest or have some sort of early activity to understand where are their presentation skills at, right? What is their comfortability in front of a room? How can I build that in our daily interactions together? And then pivot where you need to help support their work. On the flip side, you might find out that your students are far above and beyond what you thought they would be, say, in creating a website as an outcome. And so then you can say, okay, we're not just going to create a basic website. Actually, we're going to take a more complicated thing and build that because there's opportunity. Your zone of proximal development was higher than I originally thought it was. So that gives you a chance to be flexible and agile as you see the students coming in and the way that they're changing and evolving. I think scaffolding is one of those pieces that sounds fancy, but a lot of us are doing it. We're just not thinking about it in that way. And the more that you can write out that plan so that it can be clearly communicated to students, will definitely improve students' buy in and your ability to be successful in the classroom. Scaffolding is something if you've never thought about, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk through an assignment that you have or a project that you're working on that maybe students don't always do as well as you want them to. And we can come up with some ways that you might provide some support early on, some small check ins, pull out some little pieces of that assignment and build them during class to help them be successful doing the thing you want them to be able to do. So thank you for tuning in to today's Prof Talk Pod. We love your suggestions, your feedback, any burning questions that you have that you want answered. Please send me an email. You can email me at becky at theengagedprofessor.com. You can leave comments on the video. We would love for your comments or reviews on whatever platform you subscribe. And please, if you found this useful, listen to a couple other episodes and share us with your friends. And we'll see you next time.